All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Steve Malzberg Show. And, you know, when you talk about a media empire and you talk about people at the top of the pyramid in that media empire, you can't help but think of Rupert Murdoch and what an amazing story his story is. Almost all came crumbling down at one point, but, of course, ultimately, he's responsible to bring it home to everybody here, Fox News Channel, and so much more. And joining us now is a man who has written the book, as they say. It's Murdoch's World, the last of the old media empires. And David Folkenflik, who happens to be the NPR's media correspondent. I want to get the title correct. And good to see you at the studio.
Hey, thanks so much for having me in.
No, my pleasure. And I hold the book up here in my hand for all watching at Newsmax TV to see. Congratulations. Great piece of work.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And he is just a great subject to write about. You must have, enjoyed doing this book. I could tell you did.
Oh, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
It's a slice of history that takes you from Australia and his origins, even before he inherited this very small newspaper in this forgotten city on the southern coast of the country, in Adelaide, Australia, a city most Americans have never heard of. His roots as a child of one of the most prominent journalists in Australia, and a very respected newspaper correspondent and editor named Keith Murdoch, knighted for his work, and what he did to build an empire that became, I think, the dominant media presence in three of the great English-speaking language countries in the world: Australia, the U.S., and the U.K.
So the first question, of course, is how did he do it? I mean, it's the whole book, and it's not a simple question.
Sure.
But how does one man turn something as small as that into what he has turned News Corp into?
Well, I think you can boil it down to a couple of things that plays out in a lot of very different ways. But one of it, you got to just admire the man's force of will. He saw opportunity. He was stoked a bit by resentment. His father had been one of the people who led one of the big newspapers in Melbourne, the second largest city in Australia, and he felt that his father had been cheated out of an ownership stake in that company and in some other smaller newspapers that his father had. He had thought that his father had been able to hold on to.
So that was a motivating factor?
Very much.
Yeah.
And that the idea was he saw the establishment against him, and he said, I'm not going to let that stand. And so in Australia, he fought against other newspaper owners. He competed. He fought back against what he thought was the dominance of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and again in the UK against the BBC, and really demanded a place at the table. You saw that too in the creation of Fox Broadcast Network here in the 80s.
Yeah.
Why should there be only three? Well, that's the way it was done. And
Right.
he said, no more.
Right. No, absolutely. Okay, so talk about the fact that the scandal surrounding him and that affected so much. Every day you look on Drudge or you read in the papers, it was Murdoch this, Murdoch that. It's all crumbling down. Can he
Right.
survive? And will he survive? And here I think a lot of people in this country, even if they did read it, they kind of had trouble relating to it or how it affected them. As long as Fox News Channel and the New York Post and the other media outlets were still here,
sure.
then they were okay. But talk about how close it all came to going away or him losing it all.
Well, sure. In those pivotal days and weeks in the summer of 2011, revelations came out really mostly in the Guardian newspaper and then everywhere about the fact that his journalists at the largest selling Sunday paper in the country, and in fact, one of the most popular English language papers in the world, had been hacking into the cell phone messages of not only politicians, not only movie stars, but of the victims of violent crimes and of soldiers who had been killed in combat. And in addition, that his journalists had been paying off cops for information that was supposed to be kept private under British law, and also had been giving favors to very senior police officials too. And why that's important is they were looking the other way. Mm-hmm. When things came in, when there were investigations in years past, they said, we're not going to pursue this hard. And it seems very hard to conclude anything but that was influenced by their very close relationship with the police.
Right.
So you ask the question, which is, I think, the right one, why was this all at stake? Well, the Murdochs had built up this unrivaled stable of newspapers, this strong private broadcasters, a competitor to the BBC, and they were able to help influence elections. Politicians in both major parties turned to them for help and support, and it meant the political establishment didn't check what appears now to have been widespread criminality.
Right.
The police didn't do it. Without the support of those two institutions, when all the information comes out, suddenly it looked like everything could come down.
Right.
James Murdoch had to step away from his leadership of those properties. He had been tapped essentially by Rupert to be the next Rupert Murdoch's successor to lead them in the next generation.
Right. That's not going to happen.
That does not look like it's going to happen. He's quietly, by the way, trying to work his way back.
Okay.
And he's gaining a little bit of momentum to do that. But people who are handpicked by Rupert Murdoch to lead his newspapers are now in the dock. Some of them are going to be on trial just next week in London.
So with the pending trials, which I knew were coming up, is he still in the spotlight? Is there more to come out? Is it going to be reopened all over again? And could he still be in trouble? Could the Empire still be in trouble?
Well, let's put it this way: Murdoch took a number of steps that he resisted against all hope to try to maintain his control. He split the company in two. He always wanted to keep the newspapers in News Corp, surrounded by, Fox Studios and Fox News, which makes so much money for him, as a way of enduring the fact that the New York Post has never made money under his leadership since he bought it in the 70s. He just loves tabloid newspapers.
Right.
That's his real soul, right? So he had to split them up, which means they're much more vulnerable than they would otherwise have been. Les Hinton, much respected CEO of Dow Jones and oversaw the Wall Street Journal, had been the CEO of his British newspaper arm at a time when a lot of these criminal events seem to have taken place. He required Les Hinton to go. Rebecca Brooks, his surrogate daughter, the woman who had been the head of these tabloids, she too was forced to go. Yeah. He had worked for months and years to protect her above all else.
So he made the sacrifices both in reality and in the eyes of the public, so that the pressure is quote unquote off to an extent.
Well, investors are delighted by the fact that the entertainment side, unshackled from the drag of the newspapers,
two separate entities now,
are going way up,
Right.
and they were able to get shares in both the 21st Century Fox, as it's now called, the entertainment side, which includes Fox News, is turning a pretty penny for them. I think News Corp, those shares are, people are looking at them pretty hard.
We're talking to David Folkenflik, and he is the author of Murdoch's World, the last of the old media empires, here on the Steve Malzberg Show, also NPR's media correspondent. How much of it do you think it was as a result of him being targeted? Because, he's the evil Rupert Murdoch. Not only because of the empire that he has, but because of the perceived conservative empire that he has extending to Fox News and all that. How much of that made these scandals more scandalous? In other words, if he weren't Rupert Murdoch, if he were some big liberal on the other side who ran MSNBC, or somehow, we couldn't because it's NBC, but you know what I'm saying? Would he have gotten a pass? Yeah, would he have gotten a pass? Would they have come down as hard on him, out to get him so vehemently, or would they have just said, blah, blah, blah?
Well, certainly Rupert Murdoch himself, and if you want to really get an x-ray of what he's thinking, you can read the Sun tabloid, as he said under oath, or you can read his Twitter feed.
Right.
He certainly believes that there's a nexus of left-of-center news organizations, the BBC, the Guardian, the New York Times,
absolutely
that
right.
have targeted him on this.
Yeah.
I've got to say that if the New York Times were home to scores of incidents in which they targeted thousands of people for illegal phone hacking,
you think
it would be
insane.
an astonishing thing. If you look back at the Jason Blair scandal at the New York Times, a single young reporters a couple of dozen times made up stories and plagiarized stories, and that was a huge scandal. The editor-in-chief, the managing editor, the reporter, all gone.
Yeah.
They did several pages of a hard look at what they did wrong. They participated in some ways at the purging of this from the newsroom. Rupert Murdoch, it's a different culture. He's right that there are people who are critics of his for ideological reasons as well as journalistic reasons. But there is no question but that this was essentially ignored for years because of the support he had from both political parties, not just one, and also from the law enforcement establishment in the UK.
Let's talk about how Rupert Murdoch revitalized, I think is the word you use, Roger Ailes. And now we have what we have with the Fox News channel.
Sure, Roger Ailes, one of the canniest political media advisors to presidential campaigns in the modern era, and also a terrifically accomplished television producer. But he had been working actually in the NBC world. He had worked at CNBC, and he had sort of been trying to launch a channel called America's Talking. And that was his creation.
Yeah, I think I actually, if I'm I'm not mistaken, that was a long time ago, and that was in maybe the Pennsylvania Hotel or something. And I think they ran the Best of Rush TV show, and I used to anchor that and introduce various segments. Because I wouldn't even remember if you asked me what it was called, but I think that's what it was, America's Talking.
Well, and Roger Ailes was the executive producer of Rush Limbaugh's television
TV
show in the 1990s as well. You know, Murdoch had the insight that in order to ensure that Fox broadcast network would be viable, what he wanted to do was spend big. He bought the NFL rights. He stole them out from CBS, which took them completely by surprise. And in addition, he said he wanted to mimic them in another way. He wanted something like 60 Minutes. He wanted it on Sundays to follow, because 60 Minutes, time and again, is one of the top 10 shows in the country. And part of that is just that it's a direct delivery vehicle, the NFL, for viewers, right?
You're already tuned in, you keep it on. Sure.
Why not? And they do great stuff. He said, I want to do something, but I think they're too liberal. We want something with a more Murdoch sensibility. So they brought in Andrew Neil, who had been a founding chairman of Sky TV over there for Murdoch and had been editor for many years of the Sunday Times in the UK. And they said, we're going to pair you perhaps with someone. They were thinking at the time of Judith Regan, who was another figure on Fox News in later years. And Murdoch said, I don't think we've quite got it. So he brought in a consultant. That consultant was Roger Ailes. And between the two of them and some other folks, they said, let's make a channel out of this. This isn't a show. This is going to be a vehicle for our own viewers. And Fox News, what it did from the outset, it said, we're going to do something different. We're going to have voices. We're going to have strong sensibility. We're going to have attractive women. We're going to have confident men. We're going to have fun doing this. And we're going to serve audiences who feel alienated by the mainstream media, who may somehow feel like they're watching something intended for coastal elites. I don't think it's purely Republicans. I think they saw people who felt themselves to be cultural conservatives, people left out by the kinds of conversations the New York Times might be having, or people on Face the Nation might be having on Sunday mornings. And they not only tapped into that, they then purified that vision as Fox News went on. No, absolutely. We're talking to David Folkenflik, the author of the book, again, Murdoch's World, The Last of the Old Media Empires. You know, people always say you got MSNBC, you got Fox, they're almost the same. The few Republican contributors that they have, to me, fit into the rhino category. Almost without exception, and I guess Newt would be the exception. He's fairly new to that. But when Stephanie Cutter and Van Jones are the hosts of your new show, that to me, that's way to the left. But Fox is for all the right wing programming that they have. I mean, you know, Geraldo's not a right winger. Alan Combs wasn't. He's a contributor now. And almost every issue that's discussed during the course of the day, and mostly on their shows, they have a paid liberal or left contributor, whereas, you know, CNN for the most part doesn't, and MSNBC certainly doesn't at all. And like I said, Geraldo's one host. I think Shep Smith is no staunch conservative, and I could go down the list of paid contributors to Fox, about 15 names long. So this misconception that they're a propaganda arm of the the Republican Party and they get their talking points, I don't think so. Well, I look at it a little differently than you, perhaps. I think that MSNBC is what it is in response to Fox. I think Fox figured out how to be successful just after, particularly the 2000 election and the recount process, if you recall that, and then the war, and it found its footing. It had already been projecting to have dominance, and then it just took off and found itself, and it's not really looked back with some minor moments of concern since. MSNBC didn't make a profit until it started to bank left, and they just started to bank left hard. And they've got some smart people. They've got some other folks who perhaps aren't as strong performers, but they've never gotten quite the same audiences that Fox has by any stretch. CNN, I think it's harder to categorize. I think that there are some people who you might not see as conservatives. I think that the nature of as I'm a former political reporter and still do a lot of political and media reporting, and my sense is that the center of the Republican Party and the center of political discourse has shifted to the right to a significant degree. So you're seeing certain kinds of different figures in the conservative world on CNN appear that aren't necessarily to the right of the party, but are certainly right of center. All of that said, there are differing voices on Fox. Shep Smith, absolutely. You've heard him on issues like gay marriage. You've heard him talk about issues like torture. Absolutely. And they've taken a line quite different than you might have heard from Dick Cheney on some of this stuff. Megyn Kelly surprises very often. I don't think Megyn Kelly is a strong ideological person. No, I don't either. I do think that if you listen to her tenor and tone is different than a Shep Smith. You know, she's sort of in this
Oh,
nebulous era
absolutely.
between say Shep and
much
very much
different.
between a Sean Hannity or even a
Much
Bill
different,
O'Reilly.
yeah. But you see my point. So taking it back to where we are now with MSNBC and where we are with Fox, I don't see them as, you know, being one is the answer to the other anymore. Maybe they thought they were, but one is. I mean, there are no conservatives on MSNBC.
Well, I think
with
that
the
it's a
exception
fair,
of you could call Scarborough a conservative, but I don't buy that anymore.
I think it's fair to say that conservatives are significantly underrepresented on MSNBC. They've decided in some ways to do that.
Yeah.
I would say on Fox, from my interviews with scores of people who either used to work there or currently do, that there is a consistency to the storylines. There is a consistency to the threads. You see a varying of the decibel level and the takes. Bill O'Reilly sometimes will zig when others zag. But you see a consistency even on some of what seem to be the daytime news shows as to what's looked at and framed in a way that I think appeals to those who feel that the mainstream media is more likely to be just aimed at, you know, urban centers on the coast.
And what about the overall media bias? Where do you fit in on that? And you know, NPR. You know, when I look at a Tavis Smiley, I look at an Alec Baldwin and some of the things that Alec Baldwin in particular has said. Again, he just got a job at MSNBC as well. It seems like the more he allegedly bashes gays and allegedly bashes blacks and calls them names and makes scenes on airplanes, the more he gets hired, the more jobs he gets. A conservative under similar circumstances would have to go kiss Al Sharpton's boots, which boggles my mind, to try to keep their job. We had Stephen Jimenez, a very accomplished journalist, openly gay, wrote a book just recently on this Matthew Shepard murder, that it didn't happen the way the storyline has been told. He has not appeared on any major news show. They don't want to touch him. Ed Klein's book, The Amateur, the hardcover, the paperback's out now last year. Not one news show in the morning didn't touch him. They have an agenda. And if you don't fit into their agenda, they're not gonna touch you.
Well, look, there's a number of things to unpack there, right?
Sure.
A number of elements, some of which I may agree with more than others. If you look at even the New York Times, you know, Jill Abramson, the executive editor there, I think is more comfortable saying, you know, look, we are a more urban sensibility at the Times, and we understand that. And I think one way you can look at that is, for example, the coverage of the movement for gay rights and the movement for gay marriage, and you've seen that being viewed through the prism of the civil rights movement in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and on for African Americans gaining their full civil rights in this country. And there's an acceptance of the equation that the gay rights movement is equal to that in a way in which I think Fox has identified that there are many people in this country who haven't looked at it that way. Now, it may be 20, 30 years from now that is the consensus of the country, but the Times is more sensitive to that, and I think that, or looks at it more in that way, and I think that does speak to a slightly more urban, a slightly more liberal, progressive outlook, even if it's not this is a partisan thing. You know, under Howell Raines, there were moments where things seemed a little bit more purely ideological.
With all due respect, that's not just the Times.
No, I'm using that as an example.
It's ABC, CBS, NBC, MSNBC, it's Washington Post, New York Times. It's all these outlets.
And I think
the Gosnell trial, another example. New York Times can't bring itself to call a dead baby a dead baby. It's a dead fetus, even after it's delivered and killed. I mean, there's a million examples. Look, come back, because this is great. We're just up against a hard break. Again, the book, Murdoch's World, ladies